So we're live. Hello, everybody. Colin Tansley from the Intellect Group. Another short episode of Risk Watchdogs Live. Today, I'm talking with Andy Webb. Andy and I have spoken before. We're having a chat during the week, and we thought that it might be useful just to kick about due diligence. Due diligence does come up in the news quite a bit, and I've seen some news pieces where there's been some failures of organisations not to conduct proper due diligence, and have been found wanting and have ended up being fined, etc. So we thought we'd just talk about that, what we think due diligence is, what Andy thinks due diligence is, some of the terminology. So what is it, Andy? You work in compliance, you do this day in, day out. What is compliance from your perspective?
Well, simply due diligence is establishing the bona fide credentials of your client or your proposed client in terms of financial transaction. So again, the standard things that we see is, I use the term KYC, obviously things like address verification, and obviously we're looking at their identity as well.
So here's a question for you. How well do you think regulated businesses do it?
It's very mixed, very mixed. You have, let's call them registered businesses, and certainly the likes of trust companies, for example, there's a huge amount of regulatory pressure on them. So they tend to be pretty good at gathering these things. Banks these days are particularly good. And I must admit, I've worked in the environment of investment businesses, and by the nature of the investment business, you tend to gather a great deal of information about your client.
Yeah, and that for me, as you know, I train this stuff, and you've been on the courses before, and I always say that you're going to get a better product out of your searches if you gather information in the first place, because the first stage of it is about verification, isn't it? About, you know, the KYC, about knowing your customer, that's about proven identity. Is this person who they say they are? Because there's very few meetings, I guess, nowadays that are face-to-face.
That's a difficulty. I've always said to people that I like to meet people face-to-face and try and form some sort of relationship, see the whites of their eyes. I understand we can't do that at this moment in time.
No.
But I must admit, I tend to go further, because when we talk about due diligence, that's the basis of proving who that person is, where they live. Yeah. Now there's a requirement that you should get their tax reference number to see where they're resident for paying tax.
Yeah.
But you go to the subject of enhanced due diligence. Now, what exactly enhanced due diligence is tends to depend on the circumstances. I have people, and I look at the codes that say potentially get an additional utility bill, for example, or get some further form of ID. But I must admit, I tend to, for high-risk clients, go down the route of literally getting a CV from them.
Yeah, and I think the better companies do that. I think it gives you a profile to start with, doesn't it? It's funny.
It is about knowing your client. Yeah. And this is it. If you're going to enter into any client relationship, and I have to say this from a trust background, the most important thing is having a profile about your clients. Okay, we talk about beneficiaries of a trust, understanding their personal circumstances. So I will gather a lot of data that I can pick up that allows me to interact with the clients. This is something that people forget.
Yeah. But why, I suppose for the people that aren't familiar with this, why do registered businesses have to do it? What's the primary purpose of all this?
Well, it's actually to prevent money laundering is the huge big drive. Yeah. You've certainly got trust companies offshore that in the past have been seen to offer quite opaque services that really disguises the identity of the ultimate beneficial owner. And that's the drive there. We've got to realise as part of that due diligence is we're actually confirming the source of wealth or the source of funds. Now, people get confused as to what they both mean.
Yeah.
Really, when we talk about the source of funds for that particular transaction, I think increasingly we're being realistic and trying to look at the overall wealth of clients. If they represent a higher risk, for example, from the country that they come from, maybe a risk factor, then you'd want to know their overall wealth. Now, certainly within the investment business I've worked in, this is exactly what we gather on people, because we can't advise them on investments, which is the beautiful thing about it, unless we know about their overall wealth. So that's where investment businesses tend to do particularly well. Trust companies face a few difficulties, in all fairness.
Yeah. No, and I think there's a greater power at play with, for me anyway, being a sort of former cop, in that it's all about preventing crime, isn't it? And if you can switch off criminal money, then they can't then they can't function, or make it's very, very difficult for them to function. So I think at the very top of it, at strategic level, for me, that's where that comes in. But and what about the terminology? Because that's one thing that always comes up. We've mentioned KYC. We've talked about what a lot of people know as EDD, enhanced due diligence, and then there's due diligence. Is there a sort of difference between the three products then?
Well, I must admit, I'm pretty old school.
Yeah.
So I came up with the term, I was used to the term KYC. We talk about CDD these days, client due diligence, or as you mentioned, enhanced due diligence.
Yeah.
I have been told off for using KYC, that is very old-fashioned, that is not just presenting your passport and your utility bill.
Yeah.
Well, I'm quite happy using the term KYC. It's know your client. Know your client sufficiently for the business that you're entering into and to meet your regulatory requirements, which is to find that person, establish where they live, and to ensure that the funds that are being used in the transaction are legitimate.
And just out of curiosity, more than anything else, I mean, and I see this because I do, and not only do I training, but I provide the products to people as well. There's sometimes, for me, sometimes a bit about managing expectations from clients about, so what do you want in an EDD report from a third-party provider? Do you physically say to them, or I want this, or do you just expect them to know and deliver up what they think you want?
I actually like going out to people independently. I have to admit here, Colin, I use you at times. I sort of know the standard that you come up with.
Yeah.
Certainly when I would go out to somebody independently, it would be when the client represents a potentially higher risk. They may well be a PEP, which is a politically exposed person. I also bear in mind that people may well be in a position of being commercially exposed as well, well-known business people, for example.
Yeah.
So I would try and get something similar to a CV to find out their past history, to see where the funds have come from. I might even go and get pay slips if I can, or references from third parties like lawyers or accountants who've had a long-term relationship.
Yeah.
But very often the higher risk clients, and let's face it, I'll use one example. If a Russian client comes along, I would absolutely always go and get an independent report, and I would give you carte blanche, because I would want to check it with the information that I hold. I would obviously give you as much as I can to do your search, but additional information, it's just a double check for me to make sure I've made independent inquiries with somebody who's competent.
Yeah, and I suppose that might be down to the view of the regulator. They see somebody from that sort of jurisdiction is quite high risk anyway, so you've got to go to make extra inquiries and go to extra length, I suppose. But no, I think that hopefully that's of interest to our listeners. I find due diligence fascinating. I've been teaching some people all this week and regularly getting instructions, but it's always good to hear from somebody who's actually dealing with the coalface, because I often prepare reports and I never hear back about what the results are, and that's normal because it's about client confidentiality. You would expect that. And one other thing. One thing I need to ask is enhanced due diligence going on to a subscription database and putting somebody's name in?
No, not necessarily.
No.
No.
So
this is this is where it causes issues, because you can go on to a number of providers who will do checks, but be careful, because sometimes they are a helpful tool, but they are not sufficient. In fact, I've checked this. I did a straw poll. Most people, yes, will use these third-party providers, but everyone I spoke to will go online and do a Google search. And this is an area I must caution everybody on. And I think you've got more on the subject to sort of say than myself. The level of searches I see people making are woefully inadequate. They really are. And you need to learn some techniques. For example, if you're checking out somebody in France, you don't go onto Google UK.
No, exactly. And that's about understanding how these search engines work as well, which we spend a bit of time with. So that's just over 10 minutes. We normally sort of keep it about then. That's been really interesting, Andy. Thank you very much for sharing your perspectives. I'm sure there's many people listening to this that will have similar opinions. And if anybody wants to contact you about your expertise, I know you do a bit of consulting on this as well. They can find you on LinkedIn.
Yes,
and if they want to contact us, Intellect Group, because Andy does a bit of work with us, again, you'll find us here on both Facebook and LinkedIn. All right, thanks, Andy. Thanks for your time, and thank you very much, everybody. Catch up with you soon.
Bye-bye.